right, here we go. It is Thursday night. I am Matt. I am joined for our bi-weekly natural rights talk co-host Josiah Hinkle from the American Natural Rights Foundation. How's it going, Josiah?
Good. How are you doing, everybody?
I am very good. Looks like you are in sweltering conditions out there in beautiful Montana.
Yeah, it's definitely getting hot.
Yeah. So anyone who's unfamiliar with this kind of routinely bi-weekly show that we put on, we talk natural rights. We talk basically the history of rights, and specifically we've gotten into the development of the United States and kind of the philosophy that came to create it. So we really dive into these things, uh, luckily enough, through the research that Josiah is doing at ANRF. So I'm very lucky to just be basically the facilitator to bring this information to light here. So to help us out, make sure like, comment, subscribe, share, hit the notification bell. We are live on the blockchain, so if you're watching there, please upvote us and help us out as far as that algorithm goes as well. And yeah, that's it. So we have a pretty interesting show. We got a ton to cover this evening. I'll lead it off with this. So this can be a very touchy subject for a lot of people, obviously, and the last a couple of years, and specifically the last like year and a half that we've been through in the country. But we're going to talk about kind of the historical vestiges of racism, and some of the sociology that contributed to it in this country. Before we kind of get into the specifics, Josiah, like what really kind of, when you first started doing this research, what really kind of jumped out at you? Like, did anything kind of like surprise you?
Yeah, I basically did a lot of this research, 4 or 5 years ago, and when I did it mostly just like as a leisure, not most of what I was doing was dealing with really specifics in the law and legal process. But this is just basically like historical information, kind of the underlying the developments of every the law and our political institutions.
Yep.
And one of the things that I found remarkable was when I went back to try to find the sources that I remembered having reviewed 4 or 5 years ago. I came up short. I literally, I think it was like the first 14 links that I clicked on were literally just like propaganda spinning some story different than the research that, what the research showed 4 or 5 years ago. And so, with like a huge emphasis on race and racism,
Mm.
and spinning racism, in, or at least the founding fathers, and slavery in this light of modern day racism, and understanding, the influence that educated men, the influence that science and information and education of the day, had on educated men. Um, it was important to kind of go back and address what does it mean for the founding fathers to have been slaveholders, if they were, if they weren't, and when you do that, you find basically it goes back to the sociology of the day. So um, that's kind of what spawned this. Since this is basically the pre-Civil War, this is just a necessary component, kind of helping to set the frame of reference for everything that we're about to talk about afterward,
Okay.
in relation to the
Awesome.
Civil War and slavery. Because it
Yeah.
seems to be that the new narrative, which is not, historically supported, is that it's all about slavery and stopping slavery and supporting slavery. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and that's also that's an interesting distinction, and we'll get into the specifics here. But um, the culture of racism, like everyone wants to make the slavery to be the racism. I mean, I'm sorry, the slavery to be the culture. When truthfully, the slavery was what was produced because of the culture that was behind it. And so I think that's a really important distinction, which obviously we'll kind of draw out here as we kind of talk through the background here. But so let me pull up our notes. I always want to make sure that I am zooming this in enough so that people can actually see it.
Sounds good.
But kick us off here. So just the idea of what constitutes inferior. Let's roll with that.
Right. So inferior races is basically the sociology of the day, held to this concept that there were inferior races. And so we're going to basically talk about how that played into the perspective of the different in certain people's minds, the difference between races. So
right.
From an article titled Doing an About Face on Race, Mick Maroney discusses a hugely ambitious thesis involving fragments of history, sociological commentary, and statistical analysis by Dr. Steve Garner, who is a former lecturer in applied sociology at the University of College Cork in Ireland. Hostile description of the inferior Irish begin from Giraldus Cambrensis, 1147 AD, to the 17th century Protestant New England colonists. Clear men they are of skin and hue, but of themselves careless and bestial, wrote Edmund Campion in 1633. Because the Irish had the same skin color, the colonists emphasized cultural barbarity, comparing the Irish to Native Americans or Connaught cabins, and Connaught's just a province in Ireland, to African or quote-unquote Negro huts. Peaking at 3.5% of the population in 1861, the Irish in Britain were regarded as naturally depraved and blamed for poverty, disease, slums, and disorder. Tracts such as Robert Knox's Races of Man in 1850 characterized Celts as rash, childish, and rebellious, while Victorian illustrators depicted an ape-faced bestial Paddy stereotype. Garner claims that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant commentators place Celts closer to Africans than Anglo-Saxons. Some analysts claim the Irish were viewed as equal on any level, the Irish weren't viewed as equal on any level to the English. The fact that they were quote unquote white accounted for nothing. They were a different ethnic group and an inferior one. This continued on well past the age of indentured servitude. Also, the laws surrounding indentured servitude were incredibly lax prior to 1682. It was only then that Charles II instituted a law mandating that the contracts they signed had to be witnessed by magistrates. Prior to that, there were many claims of kidnapping, ill treatment, abuse, and slavery. In addition, there were rumors as early as 1649 that anyone who signed an indenture contract was sold as a slave upon reaching Virginia. So from an article discussing the history of Irish slavery, it reads, a proclamation by James I was for the due and speedy execution of the statute against rogues, vagabonds, idle, and dissolute persons. This renewed an older Elizabethan law that criminalized repeated vagabondage and idleness in 1597. The Privy Council named Newfoundland, the East and West Indies, France, Germany, and the Low Countries, or any of them, as the location for banishment. These ideological attempts to, quote-unquote, correct poverty through subjugation, forced labor, partly explain the disproportionately high level of forced transportations from Ireland to the American colonies in the wake of the Cromwellian War. Of the historical record of the officially sanctioned transportations and illicit kidnapping that did occur, the most infamous case involved David Selleck, a prominent tobacco merchant from Boston, New England. On 6 September 1653, a warrant was awarded to Selleck after he had petitioned for it to transport 400 Irish children into New England and Virginia. These children were presumably earmarked by the Puritans as either orphans from destitute families who, thanks in no small part to the brutal military tactics of the invading force, had no means to provide for themselves. As on the 11th October 1653, Alderman Tichborne was ordered by the council to draft an act for transportation of poor Irish children to England and the plantations. So that's a law authorizing this forced transportation.
Yep.
What occurred was very different to this initial plan. Profit appears to have been the primary motive, concealed in this instance beneath the veneer of quote-unquote public service. Despite the initial warrant to transport children, they instead sought out adolescents and adults, quote, 250 Irish women above the age of 12 and under the age of 45, and also 300 men above the age of 12 and under the age of 50 years. The specific age restrictions indicated that Selleck and his partner, Mr. Leader, wanted a cargo which would fetch a good price for them in the colonies. The authorization granted was essentially the legalized kidnapping of the poor. But again, unlike today, the poverty was seen as like a natural consequence of their inferior, status among the races. So it was basically, in their perspective, benevolent England, coming in to solve their problems by, kidnapping them and selling them into forced labor.
Yeah, and
So,
what's also to note here, which is maybe not necessarily that's something that's ubiquitous or uh, kind of universal, but that distinction that was made is being made based off of something other than skin color, right? It's being
right.
made based off of what they would call cultural heritage, right, which had more to do with maybe say religion or geographic location and things like that,
In,
and then also income, right?
yeah, well, I was going to say, in a lot of ways, it actually had to do with the difference in behavior. So you're
Hmm.
going to hear, we're actually going to read from the particular act itself here in a second, and then later we're going to talk about a trial that went up, and essentially you're going to see how, just like you're saying, it's not based on skin color, it's based on this notion of an inferior race. Well, that notion of inferior race actually has very real and considerable, realities, or I'm sorry, yeah, like origins in reality,
Mm.
right? So
Yep.
basically, just like they're saying, poverty, slum, all those things that the Irish were being blamed for, they're essentially thinking this is just a natural consequence of how their inferior race governs themselves. So if we sell them into, slavery, where they're now governed by someone who's more, you know, capable, right? Then it's
Yeah, what
better
they would
off for
consider.
them, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I'll let you move forward here and not kind of belabor the point
no,
too
you're
much,
good.
but this is the benevolent, highly evolved people who think that these folks are savages, and they would be better off being sold into slavery in a better situation than living out a savage life as they have prior, under their own culture, so to speak. It's pretty. I wish I could say that this was isolated in history, but this has echoes throughout time. So
Yeah, definitely. And like you're saying, like the cultural differences, like absolutely it's part of, the Irish culture to have, roaming, bards of that sort of thing.
right.
So these people were just seen as, people without any, means of livelihood,
Yep.
Anyway, so yeah, the act actually reads that the said number of Irish persons, both men and women, may probably be had in the county of Cork, who now live like beggars and vagabonds, and follow no lawful vocations. These are therefore to authorize the said Robert Lord Broghill to cause search to be made within the said county of Cork for all persons of the Irish nation, that are rogues, vagabonds, idlers, and wanderers, and such as have no means to get their livelihood by labor or otherwise, or such as being able to labor shall refuse to do so. And such persons to cause to be apprehended, taken, and delivered unto said Selic and leader, or their agents, according to the said engagement mentioned, and as may answer the same for transporting the said Irish to the New England as said above, provided that no person be taken or molested by color hereof that hath any means, and remember that color is color of law, right?
Right.
um, by himself or friends to support and maintain himself, or that is a laborer or husbandman, or by any lawful ways and means is able to provide for and maintain himself. So you can see the same primitive idea, that this entire forced labor system is justified, is, based on that same belief, like that they're an inferior race, and, you know, they're doing their best to help them not, help them become civilized.
Yeah, and they're specifically targeting the folks within that cultural subgroup that don't, I would say, closely align with the values of their positions, right? So
Definitely.
if you were Irish and you held down a job and things like that, you're not getting dragged out of the job and sold into slavery. It's more so the folks that were easier to pick out as, quote unquote, the oddballs, right? That were kind of doing things as if, they were, free souls wandering about the countryside.
Well, I do think that as an interesting take on that, one perspective I have just from my research, so it's obviously, I'm no historian, I'm not an expert to any degree, but
Sure.
from my perspective, I kind of admire the English to a certain degree because I do see that very early on, and I'm talking, the initial, heptarchy that was there, around 1100 or, 800, 1100 AD, you really saw the development of like a culture that tried to set itself apart from just, it tried to be something that was developed in every aspect, which is like the whole concept of having like proper or, just any of that stuff. Everything
Right.
to the fine, the most minute detail was articulated and meted out and thought about and considered and made into a thing because it's like, I think about it like one good illustration is just like consider, I don't know, just like an indigenous tribal population and what their
Mhm.
normal clothing looks like. It looks like normal, natural native clothing. You find
Right.
it just about in every primitive culture everywhere. But then you see the English and they're like full get-ups and they're like ridiculous. They're like these huge hats, these feathers, these, you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
it's literally to set themselves apart from, you see what I mean? Because in their minds, they are literally creating civilization, which is something, advanced and developed beyond just the state of, natural man.
Right.
And so this idea, obviously is a natural consequence of that, kind of arrogant perspective, but you know what I mean? That
Yeah.
there are inferior races that kind of can't figure out civilization. So we'll force them into it and help them out.
Yeah, it's the overreach of the concept, right? Like it's
Right.
the
Well,
yeah,
just a
like the
natural consequence. You know what I mean?
yeah.
People have a logic, they have a capacity for logical reasoning. And if they have the premises, which are wrong, they take that premise to the, natural logical conclusion and they're going to have some wrong behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
most definitely.
Let's see. So to quell any arguments that they weren't enslaved, listen to the following clause. So it says, and provided that no person, being once apprehended, be discharged, but by special order in writing under the hand of the Lord of the said Lord Broghill. So no legal rights would be recognized, right, from a court, because the fact that the only thing legally, able to discharge them from his holding basically is his own written consent.
Right.
And in this last clause, you'll see here that there was really an economic, basis for England to kind of go along with this or have this, you know what I mean? So it's like you have the logical concept, right? That's based in religion and based in, primitive sociology. And then additionally, you have this economic pressure, right? That actually also helps them to make the decision.
Hmm.
So the said Mr. Selleck and leader being at all charge of providing for them and conducting them to the waterside and maintaining them well from the time of their receiving them, and the Commonwealth to be freed from all charge here therein, meaning that the obligation for their care was no longer on the Commonwealth of England, but now was on Mr. Selleck and Mr. Leader personally, right? So you see
Yeah.
what I mean? So like, if there was such a thing as like a welfare statute or something in England, and you have these people who, they're homeless, they're beggars, they're whatever, this or that, you could see where an argument could be made. You see what I mean? That this was literally, it's eating up the substance of England. We better send them off. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's I would draw the comparison to say like the current system in the United States is used maybe maybe identifying this, but used in a little bit of a different sense in that folks that are like, wards of the state and things like that are essentially now kept close to the vest in terms of the state is concerned with respect to, infringing on their freedoms and whatnot. Here, they're essentially trying to discharge that
Yeah.
duty to someone else, and they're
Right.
looking at it. I mean, whether it's a justification or if it's a rationalization, it
Right.
seems like
Yeah.
that's what they're using it for.
Hmm. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So let's see here. So next we're going to talk about the Viadolid debate, and just want to apologize up front for all of the names I'm probably about to butcher. But so the Viadolid debate was the first moral debate in European history to discuss the rights and treatment of an indigenous people by European colonizers. Held in the Colegio de San Gregorio in the Spanish city of Valladolid, it was a moral and theological debate about the conquest of the Americas, its justification for the conversion to Catholicism, and more specifically about the relations between the European settlers and the natives of the New World. It consisted of a number of opposing views about the way natives were to be integrated into Spanish society, their conversion to Catholicism, and their right. A controversial theologian, Dominican friar and bishop of Chiapas, Bartolome de las Casas, argued that the Amerindians were free men in the natural order, despite their practice of human sacrifices and other such customs, deserving the same consideration as the colonizers. Opposing this view were a number of scholars and priests, and in a moment I'm going to basically try to help us understand the mindset of the people who are arguing this opposing opinion, being scholars and priests, being educated men.
Right.
So, because, a lot of times they're made out to just be like a bunch of racists, like I was saying, so the
They're just
inevitable.
dumb hicks.
Right. And yeah, exactly. And so then what do you think ends up being what ends up happening as a consequence is we just disregard all that, which is okay, to your own, to your own dismay. But I mean, it's really unfortunate.
And on the flip side of that, if you're the intellectual who comes up with some kind of justification for subjugating a group of people or something like that, and the overwhelming consensus against you isn't necessarily fighting you on on like an intellectual level, they're fighting you basically, calling you a dumb hick. I mean, you're essentially going to double down. You're not going to be like, oh, well, because so many of you are shouting at me and calling me a dumb hick is exactly why I'm going to change my frame of reference. If anything, those folks are going to end up getting defensive and kind of
Right.
cranking it up to 11, but
well, that's the point, right? Like I keep mentioning, we're at war. Like this is just a tactic which keeps us distracted and basically passive, because we're effectively passive. We're not doing anything,
Yeah.
So, we're not doing anything of any substance against the people who are the enemies of the war. We're just fighting each other.
It keeps you in the name calling portion of the battle, and it keeps you away from the portion of the battle where you're actually having, rational, deep conversation and undermining the points of the people that are, again, not stupid. They're learned and they can put together an argument. It just so happens that, their frame of reference is kind of tilted in a way such that, if you did take the time to dismantle their argument, you could, right? But yeah. So anyway.
Well, I think a lot of that, what I'm trying to say is essentially the real enemies are much more enemy than these little squabbles make us enemies. Does that make sense?
Oh yes, yeah, no, that's totally true too. It's
you and me could have an argument about an idea, or what were they racist? Like we think about it today, or were they not racist? That's our little squabble, and we will or won't end up fighting against someone who's literally oh my God, what is happening with COVID and with the Federal Reserve right now?
Yeah,
so
and there's also a gigantic. There's a gigantic divide between someone who might slip and use the wrong word or something like that, and someone who academically spends their time trying to find reasons for why a group of people should be subjugated, right? There's a large difference between those two.
Right. Well, that's part of the tactic. If they can seed that, if they can plant that, sow that seed of conflict, then it'll grow into a big division between us. And instead of being able to come to a consensus and fight against these fuckers, against these people, we're we're basically just going to do what we've done for the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, people have
Yeah.
been waking up since the 2000s, like earlier than that. I don't even mean to say, whatever. I just mean, look how we haven't done anything, nothing's really happened. But how much infighting has there been in the last 20 years? Because I
Yeah.
think it's gone, the dial's
Yeah.
gone off the fucking thing.
Oh yeah, and the question becomes how it ends up getting channeled, right? Like, does it get it channeled in a direction where we have a more civil debate over what's going on, or does it get channeled into French Revolution, right? Like that's
Yeah.
basically where we're at, you know. So
Well,
yeah,
I think honestly they played their cards a little too soon in the last couple of years, and I think that they kind of showed their clown face, and
Mm.
I think that the whole world's waking up to it, kind of. Like, we're still got our infighting, so we got to figure that out. But I mean, there's going to be a time, whether we do solve the infighting or not, there's going to be a time where we are going to recognize the enemy. And
Yeah.
that's going to make us have, at least if we haven't stopped the infighting, we're going to be able to decide, like, hey, what's more important,
Oh yeah, most definitely.
They're coming
So
for us, man. That's what's up.
they are.
Yeah.
All
So
right, where were we?
so it consists. Okay. Let's see. We were down.
Opposing this
So
view?
including. All right. So opposing this view were a number of scholars and priests, including humanist scholar Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, who argued that the human sacrifice of innocents, cannibalism, and other such crimes against nature were unacceptable and should be suppressed by any means possible, including war. So this topic of historical racism, right, is not like a thoughtless, crude, dim-witted, crude conclusion, of the quick to conclude, Sorry, this isn't like some dim-witted conclusion that it's made out to be. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? This is like literally based in these people are cannibals. Like, these people have human sacrifice. Like, in our societies, we call that crime. So obviously we would hold the people who are doing it accountable, but it's literally the entire society doing it. So what do? You put the whole society in jail? Like, this is England, right? Trying to comprehend, how do you deal with this? Or this is Spain, rather. But this is the point, right? If you're putting all these people in jail because of these actions that they're doing based on the culture that they won't let go of, then you have this huge expense for the state, or for the Commonwealth. So it's like, it just makes sense that you'd be like, all right, well, subjugate them, like, make them stop all that shit. You know what I mean? Like, beat them when they do it. Like, they're animals, because they're not, when actually it's a completely different situation than that, right? It's human culture, which obviously has stages of primacy, or not primacy, primitiveness.
Yeah,
It has developed through time, obviously.
and it takes a long time for that to move in whatever direction it's going to. Whereas, most of these, quote unquote noblemen want a expeditious resolution to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which those two things don't match, right? Like, if
Think about it. In the religious, sorry to cut you off. Did you want to
sure, go
finish?
ahead. No,
In the
that's
religious
basically
context, you have to remember it's an imperative, right? Like, they're not allowed to let the innocent, the person who's being sacrificed by the society, come to that harm, right? So, like, under religious grounds, you know what I mean? And again, in like England and in Spain, a lot of times that ecclesiastics authority is a part of the state.
Right.
So, you know what I mean? So the military, all of that is just the same, you know what I mean? They all act with the same hand. Whereas we kind of have a distinguishment here, and religion isn't exactly as influential on behaviors, like that. But
Right.
like, what you're seeing though is as they try to, like, okay, so do we all agree that cannibalism is a primitive, behavior done by, that's not appropriate?
Yep.
And so, right. And same with human sacrifice. And so it's like, while they came to this consensus, they truly believed that the entire world would come to this civilized, right? The world that would be capable of being civilized would come to this conclusion. And watch, as they try to bring civilization to these natives, the natives don't adopt it, right? They keep their own culture. And so what does this mean? How do you literally deal with this? and not just it's a religious imperative for them to go deal with it, but how do you actually deal with the fact that, as far as England's theology and political philosophy goes, these people are all criminals.
Right.
They're literally not capable of becoming civilized people. So it's just like I see it, instead of it being like, oh, you just want to subjugate other people and have control over them, and or whatever, or like you're so dumb to think that the races are literally like inferior, that like that. You have these behaviors that you literally cannot abide by, right?
Yeah.
Like, and so that ends up being like, well, it's justified then to go stop them. If they're not going to stop, then by war, because what else, what else is there?
Yeah. Well,
See what
so
I mean? Like today we have the luxury of not having a bunch of behaviors that are grotesque to nature, and that we have to, what I mean, apart from tyranny, right?
right.
So
Well, so and this is also something that happens throughout time where something that is seemingly illogical to an individual or a group ends up getting rationalized, or certain assumptions are made, right? And so
mhm,
that assumption that quote unquote the savages just can't live a civilized life or refuse to live a civilized life is the rationalization of that cognitive dissonance that they chose to live that life, right? Like
mhm,
it's not
yeah,
necessarily and so some folks coming from their perspective, a certain perspective, could never grasp the idea that individuals or a group would choose to live that kind of lifestyle. And so
exactly,
the rationalization isn't that like, oh well, they chose a different way. The rationalization is, they are subhuman, or they're not cultured, or they're,
exactly,
less than
exactly.
us. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, you got it just right there.
Yep.
Exactly. So like this is why people like uh, Las Casas, when he spent time with the Native Americans, he ended up seeing, their humanity, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so this is what literally gave this debate its prompting, right?
Mm.
So let's
So
see, where
enter the
was it?
priests.
Yeah, let's see. So Spanish priests, a colloquial reference to the presence. Sorry, my eyes are not working. Spanish priests, a colloquial reference to the presence of the Catholic Church in the Americas during their colonization by Spain, were responsible for the conversion of indigenous peoples to Catholicism in the Americas. A two-pronged philosophy of humanizing drove the Church's conversion impetus. If the indigenous were actually human beings, then they could and should be saved from their barbarous heathenism via the gift of Catholicism. In this sense, a secondary strain of dehumanization occurred because if the native populations were not able to be saved, then they could be exploited as slave labor.
Mm.
So much the same that you would think of like a horse or some other animal of I forget what we call that, bird, or yeah, burden or something.
Right.
Um, Soon after the first conquistadors arrived in the Americas in the late 15th century, Spanish missionaries and priests were sent to settle in new colonies, establish missions, and spread the Catholic faith, both as a source of potential enlightenment as well as a source of social control. Many of the indigenous populations were quite resistant to the new religion and customs of the European colonists, and conversion was often done by force through enslavement, dispossession, and frequently physical violence. And for a scholar, to be a scholar involves more than mere learning. A genuine scholar possesses something more. He penetrates and understands the principle and laws of the particular department of human knowledge with which he professes acquaintance. He imbibes the life of science, and in his mind is transfused and molded by its energy and spirit. So while these men certainly fell victim to, a primitive sociology, they're definitely, intellectual, educated, moral men trying to do the best, to, reason, to, figure out how to deal with this very complex sociological issue.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The best that they can.
And,
So,
and and again, that's where that rationalization comes into play. It's like it's like when you are looking at something that you don't fully comprehend, you can come up with completely irrational conclusions, right? And so,
well,
go
yeah, go
ahead.
ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just saying, like your mind wants to fill in the blanks, right? Like it wants to solve the problem, or it wants to answer the question that can't be answered. And so in some of these cases, they are taking a scholarly approach, but the scholarly approach is resulting in, I mean, if you're in favor of subjugation, it's you're erring on the side of being expeditious to solve the problem.
Well, I
Then
think
you
it's actually a belief, just like, again, it's not like, like it's literally like the belief that they're an inferior race, that they're not capable of becoming civilized.
Well, yeah, and that belief kind of in a way lacking, the natural scientific basis for it, is where they go
Well,
awry, right?
science, I mean, the experimental science, if that's what you mean, the experimental sciences didn't really develop for 2 centuries later, maybe
Right.
even three. So it's,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? It's, they're doing the best they can, is in my view, basically, which,
Right.
you know what I mean? And for there to be actual real, offenses, it actually makes sense to me that they would come to this conclusion, not just because of the desire for subjugation, right? Like, the world is, all of these concepts are gone, and we just have the indigenous people, and we invaded, and now we're going to subjugate you, right? That's a
Yeah.
completely different story than we landed here, we're explorers, we set up a settlement on this area that didn't appear, uh, like there was any kind of civilization here or anything, right?
Mhm.
And I don't know, maybe their people were attacked. Maybe, who knows? Like, maybe their people were kidnapped and used in a human sacrifice,
Right.
right? And like, of course, this would set off bands of, settlers who are going to go and be like, what happened to our guy? And then when they find out, they're going to be freaking out. And they're going to be like, oh, these people are fucking insane, and they're going to
Yes.
go back and they're going to be like, hey, king, we got to do something. You know what I mean? They have a real situation they're dealing with, but absolutely it then turns into, just a logical conclusion, like, we don't look anymore. We don't,
Right.
we know, you know what I mean? That's a done subject. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Whereas De Las Casas goes, you know what I mean? He's literally living with them. He learns their language. He interacts with them and learns their culture. And this is where he's coming to the ability to basically bring back to, the Europe, and explain that these are people. They are not animals the way that we thought they were. You know what I
Right.
mean? And so these other people are just coming to, the logical defense of that, saying like, wait a minute, but what about all these things, So, you know what I mean? It's a very admirable effort to try to figure out how to be doing it,
Oh
you
no,
know?
I hear you. They are, and this also gets back to the concept of human beings. I wouldn't necessarily say like over the last 1,000 years necessarily got substantially smarter in terms of capacity. I would say over the last 1,000, 2,000 years, where they've gotten quote unquote smarter. It's not even smarter. It's just the 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 continuum or the universe of data and information that's available
Yeah,
to us collectively is like orders of magnitude greater than it was for say
right.
someone back in the 16, 17, 1800s trying to
Yep.
make this assessment. Yeah. No, I'm on board with you with that.
It's actually facilitated that dumbing down. But I was going to
Yeah.
add, this is even great you brought this up, because I thought one of the interesting things that, on your show, the one you did on the 12th about
Mm,
education,
mm.
de-education or deschooling, um I forgot his name, but the one you had on first, he was
Yeah.
mentioning that, oh shoot, of course I'm gonna lose my train of thought. Oh man. He was he was mentioning that the, you know people back then, they had a capacity for memorization that, like, today would be completely unheard of.
Yeah.
And like, think about it, when paper is the price of, you know you can't just get paper. It's not just around. You know what I mean? It's a very expensive product. Even if you had the printing press, which didn't develop until a certain time, you didn't have paper become, cheap enough for it to actually be reasonable to have for the common people.
Oh
So
yeah,
you
and
could
only the
imagine.
aristocracy had books, right? Like, the
Right,
the poor
right.
folks didn't have books. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Or
Yeah.
even could read.
Yep.
So that's why it became so important for memorization. You can see how their basically the capacity of their resources facilitated their extreme intelligence.
Right.
And it's unfortunate that they couldn't have this data and that intelligence, but maybe we'll get there one day.
Yes. Yeah, most definitely. All right, cool. Let's
So,
keep soldering on here.
yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's right.
So, the affair is considered one of the earliest examples of moral debates about colonialism, human rights of colonized people, and international relations. In Spain, it served to establish Las Casas as the primary, though controversial, defender of the Indians. Spain's colonization and conquest of the Americas inspired an intellectual debate, especially regarding the compulsory Christianization of the Indians. Las Casas, who was from the school of Salamanca and a member of the growing Christian humanist movement, worked for years to oppose forced conversions and to expose the treatment of natives in the encomiendas. His efforts influenced the papal bull Sublimis Deux of 1537, which established the status of the Indians as rational beings. Moved by Las Casas and others in 1550, the King of Spain, Charles I, ordered further military expansion to cease until the issue was investigated. The king assembled a junta or jury of eminent doctors and theologians to hear both sides and to issue a ruling on the controversy. And Webster's dictionary defines theology as the science of God or of religion, the science which treats of the existence, character, and attributes of God, his laws, and government, the doctrines who we are to believe, and the duties we are to practice, the science of the Christian faith and life. So again, these people, being theologians, being established, doctors too, being men of science, right? They're literally the learned men of the times, right? And, of course, theologians are people who have this science of God, right? So obviously their religion is going to play into it.
Right.
But yeah, so Sepulveda took a more secular approach than Las Casas, basing his arguments largely on Aristotle and the humanist tradition to assert that some Indians were subject to enslavement due to their inability to govern themselves, and could be subdued by war if necessary. Las Casas objected, arguing that Aristotle's definition of barbarian and natural slave did not apply to the Indians, all of whom were fully capable of reason, and should be brought to Christianity without force or coercion. Sepulveda put forward many of the arguments from his Latin dialogue to assert that the barbaric traditions of certain Indians justified waging war against them. Civilized people, according to Sepulveda, were obliged to punish such vicious practices as idolatry, sodomy, and cannibalism. Wars had to be waged in order to uproot crimes that offended nature. Sepulveda issued four main justifications for just war against certain Indians. First, their natural condition deemed them unable to rule themselves, and it was the responsibility of the Spaniards to act as masters. Second, Spaniards were entitled to prevent cannibalism as a crime against nature. Third, the same went for human sacrifice. Fourth, it was important to convert Indians to Christianity. Las Casas pointed out that every individual of the relevant body's politic was obliged by international law to prevent the innocent from being treated unjustly. Human sacrifice was wrong, but it would be better to avoid war by any means possible. See how they're trying to figure out, what's the appropriate way you deal with this, right? And obviously, it would be very easy if we solve the problem by the people who are committing crimes like murder, would stop doing this.
Right.
Let's see. Las Casas pointed out that, Bartolome de las Casas' ideas had a more lasting impact on the decisions of the King Philip II, as well as on history and human rights. Las Casas' criticism of the encomienda system contributed to its replacement with the reducciones. His testimonies on the peaceful nature of the Native Americans also encouraged nonviolent policies concerning the religious conversions of the Indians in New Spain and Peru. It also helped convincing more missionaries to come to the Americas to study the indigenous people, such as Bernardino de Sahagún, who learned the native languages to discover more about their cultures and civilizations. So this is exactly, like I was saying, how Las Casas came to understand, that these were actually human beings capable of reason.
Right.
After the Viadolid Debate and the establishment of new laws protecting the Native Americans from slavery, the Atlantic slave trade significantly increased. Historians such as Sylvia Wynter argued that through Las Casas' defense of the Native Americans, he encouraged the use of African slaves for labor in the New World. In the posthum publication of Las Casas' Historia de las Indias in 1875, he expressed his regret for not being more aware of the injustice with which the Portuguese took and enslaved Africans. He explained that he had been careless in believing that the Africans were rightfully enslaved, and declared the treatment of the African slaves declared that the treatment of the African slaves was as unfair and inhumane as the treatment of the Indians. So this would cause the following information to appear, reasonable within the context. But defined in an American legal dictionary from the 1850s, white persons. The acts of Congress which authorize the naturalization of aliens confine the description of such aliens to free white persons. This, of course, excludes the African race when pure, but it is not easy to say what shade of color or mixture of blood will make a white person. The Constitution of Pennsylvania, as amended, confines the right of citizenship to free white persons. And these words, white persons or similar words, are used in most of the constitutions of the southern states, describing the electors. For example, in Wisconsin, the right of suffrage is vested by the third article of the Constitution, as follows. Section 1. Every male person of the age of 21 years or upwards, belonging to either of the following classes, who shall have resided in the state for 1 year or next preceding any election, shall be deemed a qualified elector at such election. First, white citizens of the United States. Second, white persons of foreign birth who shall have declared their intention to become citizens conformably to the laws of the United States on the subject of naturalization. So it'll make a lot of sense, right? So like you're seeing that this is the nature of the political body, or the bodies politic that were established, right? That they literally were actually, in all actuality, established for the white race. So when you're reading, the following clauses in the Declaration of Causes of Seceding States, this would make a lot of sense, right? Because literally, this all comes together, right? The sociology of the time says that the natural order is that the African race is an inferior race, just like the other races that were, regarded as inferior races. And
so let me ask you one question first. So, okay. if it weren't for the work of, who was it, Las Casas? Mm-hmm. So you're basically saying that essentially there wasn't some kind of ubiquitous understanding that resulted from that, right? Like, so like when people looked at native peoples or they looked at, quote unquote savages.
Well, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
What I was going to say was it's not like the light bulb went off and they're like, oh, okay, well, this group is more human than we gave it credit for. They didn't then automatically port that conclusion to other native peoples, right? Like it seems to kind of just have relied within that one area. And also the idea that like maybe there would have been more, more of a slave trade from South American countries or Central American countries had this conversation not happened, right?
Well, I mean, definitely, there potentially was the influence of, after you have the protection of the Indians, then there's more of a demand for, African slave labor.
Other type of workers, yes.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that basically, like, first of all, you're absolutely right. And I don't know if you asked or if you were saying, but you're absolutely right in thinking that there was no final conclusion, right? But what I'm trying to show with this is that these are people who are not just like, I don't know, who are your racists of today? Like in my head, they're just like idiots who don't really know. I mean, you know what I mean? It's basically a stereotype. I don't really know any racists, so I don't really know what they're like. But I mean, that stereotype is there. But when you look at this, these are not that stereotype. These are definitely people who are educated, who are literally trying to understand what's appropriate. You know what I mean? That the actions of these primitive cultures are confusing to them, right? And they're basically just trying to be like, okay, well, what do? We know that's not appropriate, so I guess we stop them by force. And if they can't figure it out, then it's better for them that we subjugate them. But just like you saw in that example with the Irish, right? They were authorized to take children from destitute families, right? Who or orphaned, right? And they ended up taking, what was it, like 12-year-olds to 50-year-olds or 45-year-olds, depending on men or women. Yeah. So it's like, you know what I mean? Obviously, there's a lot of abuse that ends up happening as a result of these more theological bases. You know what I mean? That some people are just out to, get a buck. They're just out to do what they can and make what they can. Yes, it's like any other person abusing or exploiting people or a system or whatever.
And
But
the other thing to point out, it's not a justification for the activity or the action, but to point out, say in the formation of the United States of America, right? The not extending of the same, liberties and freedoms to everyone seems counterintuitive now, looking back,
right.
right? It would have
Hmm.
made sense to someone from today if they hopped in a time machine and went back to 1787 or whenever, and
Right.
basically, said, no, 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 it doesn't apply to this group. It applies to like all peoples, right?
Exactly.
When truthfully, in the time, what they were doing was actually revolutionary. They just left a bunch of groups behind that, by the way, no one else of that time was going, hey, you forgot those people, right? Like,
Yep.
there was a bunch of groups that were historically, not just throughout like tens of years, but literally thousands of years, millennia had been subjugated, and
Yes.
those people didn't make the cut. And so to look back and be like, oh, well, how did they not extend that same one? And you're like,
Mhm.
well, you got to understand that's basically completely, going against thousands of years of what they understand to be history. So
Right.
it doesn't make it right,
Well, what
but
they understand to be scientific knowledge. I mean,
right
yeah,
of the
and
day, yes.
religious too. I mean, absolutely religious too.
Mm.
Um, so let's
And it's
see.
interesting that you bring up Wisconsin too, because Wisconsin's also one of the first states to use nullification against the Fugitive Slave Acts. And so, Wisconsin's also one of those areas where a lot of people don't truly, understand kind of the history of states pushing back against, say like federal,
Oh yeah.
abuses, so to speak. And as when Wisconsin is actually one of those places. So, taking that definition from Wisconsin, also, people need to understand that Wisconsin was also one of those areas that was fairly progressive in its push against the Fugitive Slave Acts, that
Well,
were, basically national
the important
standard.
thing the important thing to realize here, the reason why this or how this is all connected, maybe it's not as clear as I was hoping it'd be, but
Mhm.
basically we're talking about the Civil War, right? And
Yeah.
we're trying to figure out what are we talking about in the Civil War? Well, we know there's a bunch of states that went to war, right? So
Hmm.
why? What's that about? Well, they created documents, right? Literally, there's a document called the Declaration of the Seceding State, or the Declaration of Causes of Seceding States. And we're
Hmm.
going to read that next. We're going to read clauses from that next. And
Go
this
for
is
it.
essentially the document that the states are using to say, like, look, this is what happened, and this is why we seceded, and that's the situation. And so that when you understand the context, right, where you've got this entire theological and sociological basis for the concept of inferior races, and the entire United States has not come to a consensus on that sociological debate. You're going to have then you have the political, in the origin of the body's politic, we have the body's politic. We have the conception that the African race is inferior. So we basically have the body's politics are not for horses. They're not for, you know, apes or for birds or for, you know what I mean? They're for human beings. And in our conception, that means this class of people and not inferior races. And
Right.
so that's why, these words are in there. And so then, um, when you read from the causes of seceding states, so for example, from Georgia, I'm going to just continue reading here.
Go for it.
It's the subordination and political and social inequality of the African race was fully conceded by all. In Mississippi, it says it has grown until it denies the right of property in slaves. It advocates Negro equality socially and politically. South Carolina, this sectional combination of northern states for the submersion of the Constitution has been aided in some of the states by elevating to citizenship persons who, by the supreme law of the land, are incapable of becoming citizens. Texas, the people have formed themselves into a great sectional party based upon an unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery. Again, see how they believe that it's helpful, it's good for the race.
Right.
Proclaiming the debasing doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race or color. a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations with divine law, or of divine laws. Excuse me. They demand the abolition of Negro slavery throughout the Confederacy, the recognition of political equality between the white and Negro races. We hold as undeniable truths that the governments of the various states and of the Confederacy itself were established exclusively by the white race, for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment. So, in other words, no Africans or agents of Africans were there at the signing of the Constitution or the creation of any of the states to actually, have agency in the political parties. So, when
Right.
you have the end of slavery and the beginning of this race, which is now allowed to have political rights, like the right of suffrage to vote, you now have an entire skew on the political society that was in existence, right? By some
Right.
crazy weird, and now admittedly, it's it's what happens when you're all wrong in your science, right? Like you're gonna
Yeah.
have problems, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's you can see where the logic comes from, right? It's not at all about this concept of we want to subjugate the African race, but rather this concept that they were probably taught from their whoever they were educated under, and you can imagine. I was watching, as an example, I was watching the movie Django a couple weeks ago,
Yeah.
and there was like I thought it was really funny. He like comes up on a horse and he's like, black men, or slaves don't ride horses in this county, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
And like he like rides a horse over here and over there, and all these people who they've just like never seen this before, right? They've
Yeah.
just like never in their wildest, or like wearing normal clothes, or carrying themselves like a person or whatever, as opposed to a slave who has a particular kind of behavior and disposition, and you know what I mean? They've learned how to behave, you know what I mean? And so you can imagine being a part of the slave society, you're never really shown like what De las Casas or Bernardino, I forgot his last name, but what they basically went on like anthropological missions, right, or religious
Right.
missions, but like anthropological in the sense that they got to know the other culture and the other society, as opposed to this, where what I mean, where they basically created a slave society. Like, you know
Yes.
what I mean? That's what you're
Yeah.
like. We beat you or we kill you if you don't stay like that. So then it creates a feedback, confirmation bias. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, exactly. So obviously, so let's see.
And it's the cognitive dissonance of, that's just the way things are, right? Like that's
Yeah,
the existence of my universe as it exists today. And
right.
if you tell me something in opposition to that, I am going to rail against it because you're essentially destroying the world that I know, right? Like you're
Well,
obliterating the existence that I've come to expect, or
Well,
I've
I don't
I've
really
come to
think so,
understand.
because with this kind of thing, I mean, I don't know. I guess you're right, because it does come down to how much cognitive dissonance it is versus how much genuine belief in the sociology it is. Because obviously, if you could simply travel to any place where there was not slavery and there were people who you could say are living amongst other people, no, you know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
you could that's like literal proof that they are fully capable of reason, that they're capable of governing themselves, that you know what I mean, that it should end slavery in a moment, you know what I
Which,
mean? It
which,
should like
which by the way, is something that, and this might be far afield, but this is also something that's kind of interesting in terms of like the United States dynamic being not necessarily a homogeneous population. It allows concepts like freedom and equality, not just for white persons, but for everyone, to actually leak or pour into the culture, because there is not, some kind of purity test in order to come into the United States. And so as a result of that, you probably had peoples, now it might have been rare, but you had peoples that came from cultures that didn't have slavery, right? That also entered the United States. Now I don't know how
mhm.
much that necessarily, affected the overall movement against slavery. But that being said, it's not North Korea, right? Like there was
Well,
not.
you should know that, I'm sorry I cut you off.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, well, you should know, the Italians, the Greeks, the Chinese, I'm sorry, I'm sure there's like 10 more that I'm not stating, and I apologize, but they were all mistreated as well, also treated as, inferior races. I don't know if it was to this degree, if it
Yep.
was just like a second class, like a class thing, or if it was literally like an inferior race concept.
Right.
But absolutely they were mistreated just the same. Um, yeah, so let's see. I think we're going to run out of time if we don't try to just power through this. So,
Yeah, that's right. Go for it.
um, while the development of their science was primitive, certainly, it was no less an attempt at moral and reasonable and rational behavior. Those abolitionists who genuinely believed in the equality of blacks had outgrown the primitive conclusions of the conventional scientific and religious worldview. Those who did not were stuck in this erroneous version of inferior races as theorized in the sociology of their time. We didn't need a war to end slavery. We needed a good debate with evidence to bring us onto the same sociological and scientifically informed page. But in America, that debate about the reality of their status as a dependent race was not allowed to naturally ensue. Part of that on account of the natural law being muddled, with the positive law, as we usually see. And on the other hand, basically, on account of, basically enemies of the United States, attacking us, and as we'll see here in the next section.
Hmm.
So this is just pre-Civil War, the preconditions of the Civil War. But the following quotes are kind of like a teaser for what's coming in the latter parts of this, little series on the Civil War. But these quotes are attributed to Abraham Lincoln about the cause of the war. So it says the true motive power of the Civil War is secreted behind the thick walls of the Vatican, the colleges and schools of the Jesuits. They have continued in a silent but most efficacious way to spread their hatred against our institutions, our laws, and our liberties, in such a way that this terrible conflict became unavoidable between the North and South. It is popery that we owe this terrible Civil War. I would have laughed at the man who would have told me that before I became president. But Professor Morse has opened my eyes on that subject. Our people are yet ready to learn and believe those things, and perhaps it is not the proper time to initiate them into the dark mysteries of hell. Sooner or later, the nation will know, and then those who have caused those desolations and disasters will be called to give an account. I do not pretend to be a prophet, but though not a prophet, I see a very dark cloud on the horizon, and that dark cloud is coming from Rome. A cyclone such as the world has never seen will pass over this country, spreading ruin and desolation from north to south. Neither I nor you, but our children will see those things. And yeah, so like if you can see that, we're the children, right?
Yep.
So the following excerpt is just basically like a detail. Is an excerpt of it's a detailed excerpt of a work called the All Wars Are Bankers' Wars. You're probably familiar with it, but among a couple other excerpts thrown in there just to kind of support the narrative that it's presenting. But it starts off, I know many people have a great deal of difficulty comprehending just how many wars are started for no other purpose than to force private central banks onto nations. So let me share a few examples so that you understand why the U.S. government is mired in so many wars against so many foreign nations. There is ample precedent for this. The United States fought the American Revolution primarily over King George III's Currency Act, which forced the colonists to conduct their business only using printed bank notes borrowed from the Bank of England at interest. Benjamin Franklin, acting as the colony's representative to Britain, argued against this move in 1763. You see, a legitimate government can both spend and lend money into circulation, while banks can only lend significant amounts of their promissory banknotes, for they can neither give away nor spend but a tiny fraction of the money the people need. Thus, when your bankers here in England place money in circulation, there is always a debt principal to be returned and usury to be paid. The result is that you have always too little credit in circulation to give the workers full employment. You do not have too many workers. You have too little money in circulation, and that money, which circulates, all bears the endless burden of unpayable debt and usury. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It is called colonial scrip, interest-free, wealth-based money issued by the colonists 1750 to 1764, before the Bank of England crooks made it illegal. We issue it in proper proportion to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to no one. The following year, King George III passed the Currency Act, which outlawed all forms of money in the colonies, forcing them to conduct all commerce using banknotes borrowed at interest from the Bank of England. The refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system, which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators, was probably the prime cause of the revolution. Following the revolution, the U.S. government actually took steps to keep the bankers out of the new government. Quote, any person holding any office or any stock in any institution in the nature of a bank for issuing or discounting bills or notes payable to the bearer or order cannot be a member of the House while he holds such office or stock. All the perplexity, and that's from the Congress of the United States, the Senate. So let's see. All the perplexities, confusion, and distresses in America arise not from defects in the Constitution or Confederation, nor from want of honor or virtue, as much from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. That's from John Adams. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks will deprive the people of the property of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. That's from Thomas Jefferson. History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuance. From James Madison. So the following quotes are from Meyer Amschel Rothschild. He says, capital must protect itself in every possible way, both by combination and legislation. Debts must be collected, mortgages foreclosed as rapidly as possible. When through process of law the common people lose their homes, they will become more docile and more easily governed through the strong arm of the government, applied by a central power of wealth under leading financiers. These truths are well known among our principal men, who are now engaged in forming an imperialism to govern the world. By dividing the voter through the political party system, we can get them to expend their energies in fighting for questions of no importance. See, this is exactly what we were just talking about. Like, this has been the plan all along. You realize these are literally quotes from hundreds of years ago. And we're just like playing into it every single day.
So now
every day
we're
wasting. What?
So this being a Rothschild quote, all right? Is this a quote pre-Revolutionary War arguing for the, basically arguing against the manipulation by the crown? Or is this a quote that hints at future aspirations, if you know what I'm saying?
Maybe you could rephrase that for me. I'm sorry. I don't know if I understood it.
So this is this is the Rothschilds, right? Like, this is the family, right?
Right.
Which by and far lots of ties have been made between that family and the central banking.
Yes, we're going to have
what ails us to this day, right?
Yeah.
So I was wondering, do you have a date on this quote?
Unfortunately, this is just the excerpt right from the All Wars Are Bankers' Wars, so I unfortunately don't have the date on this.
I'm wondering if this was. I'm wondering if this was made in defense of the colonies fighting back against the overreach, and the control being instituted by the crown, or if this is ruminations on things to come.
I would think it's probably. Let's see.
I would have to go back and read the work, but I don't know how it's being used. I just find it ironic that quote being paired with that last name is obviously needs some digging.
Yeah, we need a third part that we're going to first. We're going to have an entire, we're going to have a whole look at it. So it's a deep situation. Yeah, hours, absolutely. You're going to see that in the third.
Hold on, you're breaking up a little bit. 1 second. Let me pull you out of the stream, put you back in.
That fixed it?
A little bit. We'll work through it. All right. So let's see. And there's also a quote here about the Bank of England.
Yes, so this one's actually from a former governor of the Bank of England. Is it
Yep.
still really bad?
No, you're good.
Oh, okay, great. So it says, "It is thus by discreet action we can secure for ourselves that which has been so well planned and so successfully accomplished." So that one has a date on it, 1924. But essentially, what you're going to see is there's just a huge history of this, intentional subjugation of nations, entire nations, and that's why those quotes came up first, talking about Rome. Because in my view, it's essentially like the banking powers that arose during the 18th century in combination with the dying Holy Roman Empire, right? Created this like incognito power that decided to, literally take over the whole world. And we're going to kind of talk about that over the course of the Civil War series here.
Sure.
Right on. So just 1 year after Meyer Amschel Rothschild had uttered his infamous, quote, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws," end quote, the bankers succeeded in setting up a new private central bank called the First Bank of the United States, largely through the efforts of the Rothschilds' chief U.S. supporter, Alexander Hamilton, or, as he should otherwise be known, a traitor.
Yeah.
Founded in, sorry, I cringe when I hear him. People are like, "Oh, well, Alexander Hamilton, the founding father." I'm like, "Go fuck yourself."
Yeah.
Sorry.
The problem is they can't differentiate his involvement in the revolution with what transpired after the revolution.
Well, that's the point. I mean, that's part of it. You know what I mean? Like, okay, some of the people in the revolution, you have to understand, never wanted to stop monarchy. They just wanted to be the monarchs.
Yeah.
They just wanted a better position in the monarchy,
Yes.
So, like, yeah, fuck those people. Anyways, founded in 1791, by the end of its 20-year charter, the First Bank of the United States had almost ruined the nation's economy while enriching the bankers. Congress refused to renew the charter and signaled their intention to go back to a state-issued value-based currency on which the people paid no interest at all to any banker. This resulted in a threat from Nathan Meyer Rothschild, so his son, against the U.S. government. Either the application for renewal of the charter is granted or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war. Congress still refused to renew the charter for the First Bank of the United States, whereupon Nathan Meyer Rothschild railed, "Teach those impudent Americans a lesson, bring them back to colonial status." The British Prime Minister at the time, Spencer Perceval, was adamantly opposed to war with the United States, primarily because the majority of England's military might was occupied with the ongoing Napoleonic Wars. Spencer Perceval was concerned that Britain might not prevail in a new American war, a concern shared by many in the British government. Then Spencer Perceval was assassinated, the only British Prime Minister to be assassinated in office, and replaced by Robert Banks Jenkinson, the second Earl of Liverpool, who was fully supportive of a war to recapture the colonies. Quote, "If my son did not want wars, there would be none." Gutla Schnapper, wife of Meyer Amschel Rothschild and mother of his 5 sons, so Nathan Rothschild being one of the sons who just gave you those quotes.
Yep.
Financed at virtually no interest by the Rothschild-controlled Bank of England, Britain therein provoked the War of 1812 to recolonize the United States and force them back into the slavery of the Bank of England, or to plunge the United States into so much debt that they would be forced to accept a new private central bank. And the plan worked. Even though the War of 1812 was won by the United States, Congress was forced to grant a new charter for yet another private bank, issuing the public currency as loans at interest, the Second Bank of the United States. Quote, "The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies, which it creates out of nothing." So essentially, they make loans with money they don't have, and then later we'll learn that they demand repayment of those loans in what's called specie, right, which is coin and silver. So gold and silver coin.
Yes.
And not their banknotes.
Yeah.
So
and if you don't pay the loan they took out on your back, they will shoot you in the face. It's basically the way it comes down to it.
Well, like, the ridiculous thing here is, do you understand that they have no standing at law to collect on the debt of the loan? Do you understand? So what that means is your mortgage is, you didn't pay your mortgage, and they're going to take you to court, and they're going to foreclose on your house. Well, they have no legal standing.
Yeah.
They literally have no standing because they did not actually have any value they loaned to you. They're just promises. They're not actually value of any kind.
Yeah.
So
there's no offset. Yeah, and
there was no consideration.
And the actual repayment is done under coercion,
Yeah.
theft, and basically
Bullshit.
physical force. Like that's all it's
Yeah.
predicated upon. Yep.
Yeah. So let's see, where were we?
Andrew Jackson.
Yes, President Andrew Jackson. Once again, the nation was plunged into debt, unemployment, and poverty by the predations of the private central bank. And in 1832, Andrew Jackson successfully campaigned for his second term as president under the slogan, "Jackson and no bank." In the years leading up to the War of 1812, the U.S. economy had been on the upswing. The war with Britain, however, disrupted foreign trade. As one of the United States' largest trading partners, Britain used its navy to blockade U.S. trade with other nations. The war prevented U.S. farmers and manufacturers from exporting merchandise, blocked U.S. merchants and fishermen from sailing the high seas, and curtailed federal government revenues, which were derived mainly from tariffs on trade. By 1815, the United States found itself heavily in debt, much like it had been at the end of the Revolutionary War 30 years earlier. 6 men figured prominently in establishing this new entity, commonly referred to as the Second Bank of the United States. The financiers John Jacob Astor, David Parrish, Stephen Girard, and Jacob Barker, Alexander Dallas, who would become Secretary of the Treasury in 1814, and Representative John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. In January 1814, Congress received a petition signed by 150 businessmen from New York City, urging the legislative body to create a second national bank. In February, and again in November, Calhoun put forth plans to create a bank that would be headquartered in the District of Columbia, but his bills did not pass. In April 1814, President James Madison, who had opposed the creation of the first Bank of the United States in 1791, reluctantly admitted to the need for another national bank. He believed a bank was necessary to finance the war with Britain, but later that year, progress in peace negotiations led Madison to withdraw his support for the proposed national bank. After peace with Britain came in 1815, Congress rejected new efforts to create the bank. In the months that followed, however, the federal government's financial position deteriorated amid a broader economic downturn. Many state-chartered banks had stopped redeeming their notes. The bank opened for business in Philadelphia in January 1817. It had much in common with its forerunner, including its functions and structure. It would act as a fiscal agent for the federal government, holding its deposits, making its payments, and helping it issue debt to the public. And it would issue and redeem banknotes and keep state banks notes or issuance of notes in check. Also, like its predecessor, the bank had a 20-year charter and operated as a commercial bank that accepted deposits and made loans to the public, both business and individuals. Its board consisted of 25 directors, with 5 appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The capitalization for the second bank was $35 million, considerably higher than the $10 million underwriting of the first bank. Subscriptions went on sale in 1816, and the sale period was set at 3 weeks to make it easier for investors to buy subscriptions. Sales were held in 20 cities. After 3 weeks, $3 million of scripts remained unsold, so Philadelphia banker Stephen Girard bought them. The bank's reach was far greater than that of its predecessor. Its branches eventually totaled 25 in number, compared to only 8 for the first bank. Unlike modern central banks, the bank did not set monetary policy as we know it today. It also did not regulate, hold the reserves of, or act as a lender of the last resort for other financial institutions. The first president of the bank was William Jones, a political appointee and a former Secretary of the Navy who had gone bankrupt. Under Jones's leadership, the bank first extended too much credit and then reversed that trend too quickly. The result was a financial panic that drove the economy into a steep recession. And remember that when a recession occurs, the lower classes become very desperate, right? Which kind of have the end result of basically bolstering the government so that they can literally take care of themselves. Like a government who then can create a welfare situation so that they can survive. Yes. And at the same time, the middle class is basically to avoid that state of desperation, right? They're selling off their assets, right, at reduced rate or at depreciated values because the economy overall is depreciated. And this essentially is like legalized theft, because the rich, who can then come in with all of their capital, they can buy up all these distressed assets for pennies on the dollar, right? So when Jones resigned in 1819, shareholders elected Langdon Sheaves as president of the bank, who was an attorney from South Carolina who had served as Speaker of the House of Representatives. Sheaves cut in half the number of second banknotes in circulation, made fewer loans, foreclosed on mortgages, and extended more control over the bank's branches. He presented stank banknotes for specie, a request that specie, remember that's gold and silver coin, a request that sent many bank chartered financial institutions into bankruptcy because they did not have enough gold and silver on hand to cover the redemptions. Another depression, characterized by deflation and high unemployment, ensued. Although the economic slump was part of a worldwide downturn, the bank's policies magnified the contraction in the United States. In 1828, Andrew Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans and a determined foe of banks in general, and the Second Bank of the United States in particular, was elected President of the United States. Jackson had a strong distrust of banks in general, stemming at least in part from a land deal that had gone sour more than 2 decades before. In a deal, Jackson had accepted paper notes, essentially paper money, as payment for some land he had sold. When the buyers who had issued the notes went bankrupt, the paper he held became worthless. And that's your US dollar, literally on the verge of collapse right now.
Right.
Although Jackson managed to save himself from financial ruin, he never trusted paper notes again. In Jackson's opinion, only specie, silver or gold coins, qualified as an acceptable medium for transactions. And that's because gold and silver coins have something that's set apart from their numismatic value. So set apart from their government issued or determined value. And that is that they actually have, gold and silver at least especially, has a very wide demand in all sorts of industries. So that creates an intrinsic value in gold in the same way, because most markets actually around the world, markets like currencies or anything like that, are based on gold in a lot of other places. So there's this intrinsic value essentially with these metals that your paper dollar does not have. At the end of the day, what can you do with paper? You could write on it. It's already got writing, so that's really shitty. You could burn it. You know what I mean? Like, at the end of the day, you don't have anything valuable, and that's what the lesson is here.
Well, and it's what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say immutable, but there's also a non-relativistic idea of that intrinsic value of those items versus paper currency, which has a relativistic, it is whatever it is we say it is today, right? Like, yeah, it's like it can be whatever we say it is, and at the end of the day, there's absolutely no concrete thing that connects the paper currency with what we say it is.
Yep.
It's just you have to go with it on faith. Yeah.
And it's going to be even easier because the next disconnection is actually from physical paper in your hand that you have to count. They have to print it with an actual physical printer to make it. Now they're just going to have, they already, the degree that they do, they already have this, but they've got, digital ledgers right now. But that's different than digital currencies, which is basically the next step of, dissociating any kind of that system of value exchange from any reality that could tie it down and demand from it certain performance.
Yeah, and again, this is kind of like a conversation for another day, but I would say that the difference between a digital currency and, say, like a ledger-based, decentralized token or currency is that the algorithm is definable by which say like a Bitcoin gets produced. Whereas with a digital version of fiat currency, again, there's still absolutely no common conversion back to some level of value. It just doesn't exist.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, right. Basically, the fact that there's a finite amount of Bitcoin that can be mined is what makes it inherently.
And you have reasonable faith based off of the algorithm that it's built on, that what that supply is going to look like over time. Right?
Not necessarily, because there's some infrastructure issues, right? With the fact that it's actually on the internet, and the fact that it's got power, and the fact that there's now basically, even though the the ledger is anonymous, it's public, and that public nature creates capacities for analysts, really intelligent people whose job it is to figure shit out using data, to figure out who everybody is, who has and owns Bitcoin. And pretty much the feds have figured out everybody by now. Yes. So basically what you're looking at are, better things are like, what is it, pirate chain?
Yeah.
And private coins, yeah, basically. Privacy coins, yeah.
Yes. So, which is also a very good point. Items of specie, right, typically aren't trackable.
Right.
So, gold can be, even if you throw a serial number on it, you can melt it down into a
you
bar
pound it out.
Traceable. Yeah.
Yeah, yep. Absolutely. No, I wouldn't. You'd lose a little bit. But let's see here. So, sorry, I'm trying to remember where we were. Okay, so since banks issued paper notes, Jackson found banking practices suspicious. Jackson also distrusted credit, another function of banks, believing people should not borrow money to pay for what they wanted. Jackson's distrust of the bank was also political, based on a belief that a federal institution such as the bank trampled on states' rights. In addition, he felt that the bank put too much power in the hands of too few private citizens. The bank also lacked an effective system of regulation. In other words, it was too far outside the jurisdiction of Congress, the president, and voters. The charter for the Second Bank of the United States would expire and thus be up for renewal in 1836. However, 4 years earlier, Clay and a prominent senator pushed forward a bill that would renew the bank's charter. The 1832 Charter Renewal Bill was a calculated political move. If Jackson signed it into law, it might alienate voters in the West and South, jeopardizing Jackson's bid for a second term. If he vetoed the bill, the controversy might alienate voters in the Northeast. Biddle, who served as president from 1823 until the bank's demise in 1836, refused to accept any criticism of the bank's operations, especially claims about the mismanagement of some of the bank's branches. He was also not above allowing the bank to make loans to his friends while denying loans to those less friendly. Shortly after the election, Jackson ordered that federal deposits be removed from the Second National Bank and put into state banks. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Biddle responded to Jackson's action by announcing that the bank would not respond to the loss of government deposits by attracting new private deposits or raising new capital. Instead, the bank would limit credit and call in loans. This contraction of credit, he believed, might create a backlash against Jackson and force the president to relent and redeposit government funds in the bank, perhaps even renewing the charter. So fundamentally speaking, right, he is an economic terrorist, and he's essentially using the power of this institution and his role as the president of it to basically, hold the American people and the government hostage and extort from them.
Nothing new, unfortunately.
Well, it's just like, fuck that guy. Fuck this bullshit, dude. This is some bullshit. Like, what are we talking about? I saw shit like this happen in Montana myself. Literally, there was legislation, if I can't even remember what for, legislation that was obvious and good, and you got the fucking Koch brothers, grassroots fucking, political whatever, organization that lobbied my fucking Montana to not pass the bills. And it's just like, who the fuck are you people? I want to shoot you in the face. You do not, no, I don't mean that. I just mean that's what I want to do.
In Minecraft.
Not what I will do.
In Minecraft.
Well, I don't break laws, so that's the important part. I'm not going to murder anybody, so that's for sure. So let's see here. Sorry, I keep losing my place.
Looks like, but Biddle's move backfired.
Yeah. All right. So, but Biddle's move backfired. In the end, it helped to support Jackson's claim that the bank had been created to serve the interests of the wealthy, not to meet the nation's financial needs. And so there you go. There, idiots then and idiots now, with COVID and everything, So, although the United States government owned 20% of the stock, the Second Bank of the United States was a private corporation. The veto was unprecedented. Previous presidents had vetoed bills sparingly and only on the basis of their constitutionality. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling that the bank was constitutional, Jackson challenged the charter on that issue as well as philosophically. In the message, Jackson outlined his position for the veto. One of the most famous passages of the message comes near the end. It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, again, metaphysical jurisprudence, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection, and that is of the law, and as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles. Jackson's veto of the bill was the first step in a several-year process to kill the bank, the hated bank. The bank continued to function until the charter expired in 1836. Jackson followed Thomas Jefferson in his strict interpretation of the Constitution. The Constitution did not give Congress the power to create a bank. Hamilton created the doctrine of quote-unquote implied powers, saying that because Congress had the power to do anything necessary and proper to carry out fiscal duties, that it was implied that they had the authority to create a bank. Jackson rejected this view and subscribed to the view that if the Constitution did not strictly say a power of Congress, then Congress did not have that power. And of course, in any instance, right, it would be the states who would be the final, decision makers on what would be appropriate as to the extent of the powers. Hold on. It's the consequences of the powers delegated or the extent of the powers reserved. Right. Because they were fundamentally the parties to the constitutional compact.
Yeah.
So the National Bank violated the system of checks and balances, for it did not answer to anyone within the government. It also dominated the banking system and in effect closed out all smaller state banks. Jackson viewed this as strictly unconstitutional. Jackson in his veto stated that he believed there are no evils in government, but evils in its abuse. He viewed the violation of implying a power of Congress to create a bank as an abuse of the Constitution and its interpretation. Jackson also pointed out the fact that the National Bank exposed the American government to control of foreign interests. He cited that more than a fourth of the shareholders of the National Bank were foreigners. He attacked this citation, stating that this excludes and disregards the whole of the American people. By select foreign and elite citizens holding the stock for the bank, it in effect goes against a government balanced on equality, honesty, and fairness. The bank was controlled greatly by foreign investors and the Bank of England. These foreign investors profited greatly from the National Bank by charging interest for the use of their paper American currency. The United States Bank began to place the American people in debt by printing and charging interest on the circulation of currency. This debt was, of course, to be paid by the American citizens. True to his word, Jackson succeeded in blocking the renewal of the charter for the Second Bank of the United States. Gentlemen, I too have been a close observer of the doings of the Bank of the United States. I have had men watching you for a long time and am convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the bank. So that's essentially like using the profits of the deposits of the bank as capital for investment that they could then buy, have an increase, an appreciation of the asset, sell, return the principal, and keep the profit, right? But then what he's saying is, when you lost, you charged it to the bank, saying like, oh, people didn't, they didn't repay their loans or this or that. It's like fucking schemers.
Yeah.
You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves. I have determined to rout you out, and by the eternal, I will rout you out. Shortly after President Jackson, the only American president to actually pay off the national debt, ended the Second Bank of the United States, there was an attempted assassination which failed when both pistols used by the assassin, Richard Lawrence, failed to fire. President Zachary Taylor. President Zachary Taylor opposed the
So
creation of a new.
before you move
Sorry, go
on
ahead.
to Zach Taylor, the one thing that you just made me think about was there's like an old joke about what's the best business model in the world. You steal what you sell. It's 100% profit, right? That's
Right?
exactly this setup, right?
I think you have one. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you're it's nothing but upside, right? Like
Yeah,
even when you lose, you at least like net out at zero. It is a
but
freaking racket.
you've got two competitors, right?
Yep.
One where what you sell is created out of nothing, so you don't have to steal it. You just convince people it exists, like
Yep.
paper notes. And then the other one is a market that's protected by a government, basically like an insurance company, right? The
Yep.
government demands you have their service. Like, you know, that's some good protection, right?
Oh yeah. It's good work if you can get it.
Yeah, right? Fucking parasites. All right, so the reason why I'm just trying to go through this is because we're going to see that basically over the next few presidents that they're all basically on the same page and all just about to be assassinated. So, yep. So that's why it kind of seems a little truncated, but this is how it goes in that all wars
I'm
are
sure,
banking wars.
I'm sure it's completely unrelated to their viewpoint on central banking.
All right, President Zachary Taylor opposed the creation of a new private central bank owing to the historical abuses of the first and second banks of the United States. The idea of a national bank is dead and will not be revived in my time. Taylor died on July 9, 1850, after eating a bowl of cherries and milk, rumored to have been poisoned. The symptoms he displayed are consistent with acute arsenic poisoning. President James Buchanan. President James Buchanan also opposed a private central bank. During the Panic of 1857, he attempted to set limits on banks issuing more loans than they had actual funds and to require all issued bank notes to be backed by federal government assets. He was poisoned with arsenic and survived, although 38 other people at the dinner died. Thus, it should come as little surprise that much of the real reasons for the events of the Civil War are not well known to the average American. Let's see, so quote, the few who understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or be so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class. And so to clarify that, right, that would be people who, the capitalists, right, the very rich and powerful who have the ability to get humongous loans from these institutions will be completely happy about it. Like, what's wrong with it? I love getting huge loans. What's the deal? And those who, are dependent on its favors, like politicians and et cetera, they're not going to have any argument. They're going to get their nice career and their nice little position here, get to be a little controller and governor of some bullshit. So that's what he's referring to, right? That there will be no opposition from that class. While on the other hand, the great body of people, mentally incapable of comprehending the tremendous advantage that capital derives from the system, will bear its burdens without complaint, and perhaps without even suspecting that the system is inimical to their interests. And this from the Rothschild brothers of London, writing to associates in New York in 1863. And remember those 150 businessmen in New York, right, who urged the legislative body to create a national bank? It was like in 1814. So like it makes you wonder, who all is a part of this syndicate? Because you're going to see this New York syndicate comes up again and again and again. But President Abraham Lincoln, when the Confederacy seceded from the United States, the bankers once again saw the opportunity for a rich harvest of debt and offered to fund Lincoln's efforts to bring the South back into the Union, but at 30% interest. Lincoln remarked that he would not free the black man by enslaving the white man to the bankers, and using his authority as president, issued a new government currency, the greenback. This was a direct threat to the wealth and power of the central bankers, who quickly responded. If this mischievous financial policy, which has its origin in North America, shall become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and wealth of all countries will go to North America. That country must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe. In 1872, New York bankers, and here they are again, sent a letter to every bank in the United States urging them to fund newspapers that opposed government-issued money, Lincoln's greenbacks. So essentially propaganda, right? Dear sir, it is advisable.
Which by the way, is still backed by specie, right? Like that's
Which
That's
is
the
Lincoln's
uh,
greenback? No,
greenbacks, right?
no, it's not
No.
backed by anything, but it is free of debt.
Okay. All right.
Okay,
So there's no VIG. There's no interest rate based off of it.
right, exactly.
Okay.
And so essentially, if you're at war, right, so that's essentially like a, it's a necessary thing is how they're seeing it. You know what I
Okay.
mean? Like many of the people who did not support the first, any bank supported it after they were in dire straits after the war,
Yep.
and both times, right? Saying the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, which is why fucking the Rothschilds should honestly just be considered enemies of America. Like, I honestly just don't even understand. Well, I don't mean all necessarily, but I definitely mean Nathan Rothschild, who has clearly established himself as a traitor and enemy to America.
Oh yeah.
But let's see. So, dear sir, it is advisable to do all in your power to sustain such prominent daily and weekly newspapers as will oppose the issuing of greenback paper money, and that you also withhold patronage or favors from all applicants who are not willing to oppose the government issue of money. Let the government issue the coin and the banks issue the paper money of the country. To restore to circulation the government issue of money will be to provide the people with money, and will therefore seriously affect your individual profit as bankers and lenders, right? Because if you can go get an interest-free loan from the government, why in hell would you go get an interest-bearing loan?
Interest-bearing
Exactly.
loan. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but of course this is, or wait, there's one more. So it will not do to allow the greenback, as it is called, to circulate as money any length of time, as we cannot control that. But this is part of a larger plot to enslave all of mankind under the banking system. And part of this campaign was the Hazard Circular. So the circular, or private letter, was purported to have been brought to America by a Mr. Charles Hazard, from whom the circular derives its name. Mr. Hazard, it is said, was an agent of the capital and banking interests in London. The circular letters with which he was charged with distributing were to be given to the capitalists and bankers in New York and New England. The full letter reads as follows. So it's almost like banking interests in England, which you should understand are Rothschild and Company, are influencing banking interests in America, especially in New York. And then, as we're seeing, interests in New York are literally influencing the legislature and the government on multiple counts and producing propaganda. Like, literally, it's so fucking nuts, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Which, by the way, and you're probably going to get to this, we haven't even entered into the South printing their own money, right? Like, which I'm sure factors into the equation here.
Actually, this narrative basically just discusses central banking and the basically opposition or enemies showing themselves by attacking those who would stand against central banks, basically.
Fair
So
enough.
we're even going to go past the Civil War, and later we're going to have other kind of aspects of the pre-Civil War discussed and kind of lead up to it as well. But the next one, we're going to be talking about the actual Civil War, or the actual war time, so like 60 to 65.
Fair enough.
So
looks like there's a quote from the actual Hazard you have here.
Making sure did we get to the okay, so the full letter reads as follows. Slavery is likely to be abolished by the war power, and chattel slavery destroyed. This I and my European friends are in favor of, for slavery is but the owning of labor and carries with it the care of the laborer, while the European plan, led on by England, is capital control of labor by controlling wages. This can be done by controlling the money. The great debt that capitalists will see to it is made out of the war must be used as a measure to control the volume of money. To accomplish this, the bonds must be used as a banking basis. We are now waiting to get Secretary of the Treasury to make this recommendation to Congress. It will not do to allow the greenback, as it is called, to circulate as money any length of time, for we cannot control them, but we can control the bonds, and through them the bank issue. At the time of the circular's alleged distribution by Mr. Hazard in 1862, the United States had been fractured and was deeply embroiled in the sanguinary combat of the American Civil War. It would indeed be by the force of this war power that the institution of chattel slavery would be undone in the United States, a fact that was, whether by coincidence or prescience, yearly predicted by the Hazard Circular, for it would not be until 1863 that President Lincoln delivered the Emancipation Proclamation, making the abolition of chattel slavery a goal of the war effort. The greenback currency mentioned in the circular was the fiat stuff which sustained the Union government during the period of the war. The expenditures of the conflict far exceeded the revenues of the Union, and rather than turn to usurious loans from foreign powers, the government would print about $450 million of the paper money, backed by nothing but free of debt. This short experiment with government-issued notes was to be just that. Again, the Hazard Circular predicted after the war, agitation began immediately to return to the gold standard, and abandon the greenback, and its circulation was contracted over several years. In the correspondence between newspaper publisher Lee Crandall and Isaac Sharp, a lawyer from Kansas, the latter laid claim to the original publishing of the infamous circular and revealed how it came into his possession. Sir, in reply to your polite request of yesterday, expressing a desire to be informed of the origin of the copy of the Hazard Circular copied by the National Review some 4 years ago from the Council Grove Guard, then published by me in Council Grove, Kansas, I have to say that I obtained the original copy from Mr. J. W. Simcock, the cashier of the First National Bank of Council Grove, Kansas. I, at that time, say about the year 1873, was the attorney for that bank, and one day when the cashier was writing up and arranging a large number of accumulated letters and other papers of supposed value, either he or I came across the Hazard Circular, together with the Circular of the American Bankers, and signed by one Buell. I asked Mr. Simcock for these two circulars, and he gave them to me then, and at the same time, in reply to questions I asked him, he said that their day of usefulness was over, that his friends in New York, some bankers there, sent them to him, that he might the better understand the history and origin of the national banking system, as he was comparatively a new banker. I kept them for the light they threw upon the financial questions of the times. So this circular adds to the proof of that the financiers of England had always intended this plan of ending slavery for twofold reasons. One, slavery was cheaper to maintain through the European plan of debt slavery and monetary wage control. And two, so that the tension of slavery as a political issue would be amplified to such a degree that the states of the Union would break into open war, which we'll discuss more in depth in a later part.
Sure.
So, goaded by the private bankers, much of Europe supported the Confederacy against the Union, with the expectation that victory over Lincoln would mean the end of the greenback. France and Britain considered an outright attack on the United States to aid the Confederacy, but were held at bay by Russia, which had just ended the serfdom system and had a state central bank similar to the system the United States had been founded on. Left free of European intervention, the Union won the war, and Lincoln announced his intention to go on issuing greenbacks. Following Lincoln's assassination, the greenbacks were pulled from circulation and the American people forced to go back to an economy based on banknotes borrowed at interest from the private bankers. Tsar Alexander II, who authorized Russian military assistance to Lincoln, was subsequently the victim of multiple attempts on his life in 1866, 1879, and 1880 until his assassination in 1881. From Lincoln, so these are quotes from Lincoln. I have two great enemies, the South Army in the front of me and the bankers in the rear. Of the two, the one at my rear is the greatest foe. The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, and more selfish than bureaucracy. The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency and credits needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest. Money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity. So President James Garfield, James A. Garfield was elected president in 1880 on a platform of government control of the money supply. The chief duty of the national government in connection with the currency of the country is to coin money and declare its value. Grave doubts have been entertained whether Congress is authorized by the Constitution to make any form of paper money legal tender. The present issue of United States notes has been sustained by the necessities of war, but such paper should depend for its value and currency upon the convenience in its use and its prompt redemption in coin at the will of the holder, and not upon its compulsory circulation, which is what we have now. These notes are not money, but promises to pay money. If the holders demand it, the promise should be kept. By the experience, and this is a lot of that kind of gold back, notion that you were kind of referring to before.
Yep.
By the experience of commercial nations in all ages, it has been found that gold and silver afford the only safe foundation for a monetary system. Congress should provide that the compulsory coinage of silver now required by law may not disturb our monetary system by driving either metal out of circulation. If possible, such an adjustment should be made that the purchasing power of every coined dollar will be exactly equal to its debt-paying power in all the markets of the world. Whoever controls the volume of money in our country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or another by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. And that was Garfield 2 weeks before he was assassinated. And so he was shot on July 2nd, 1881, and died of his wounds several weeks later. Chester A. Arthur succeeded Garfield as president. President Andrew Johnson, in Andrew Johnson's 1886 fourth annual message, he dared question the validity and legitimacy of the practice of allowing the banks to make loans using ink and paper, but demanding repayment in silver and gold. The anomalous condition of our currency is in striking contrast with that which was originally designed. Our circulation now embraces first notes of the national banks, which are made receivable for all dues to the government, excluding imposts, and by all its creditors, excepting in payment of interest upon its bonds and the securities themselves. Second, legal tender issued by the United States, and which by the law requires to be received as well as in payment of all debts between citizens as of all government dues, excepting imposts. And third, gold and silver coin. By the operation of our present system of finance, however, the metallic currency, when collected, is reserved only for one class of government creditors, who, holding its bonds, semi-annually receive their interest in coin from the national treasury. There is no reason which will be accepted as satisfactory by the people why those who defend us on the land and protect us on the sea, the pensioner upon the gratitude of the nation, bearing the scars and wounds received while in its service, the public servants in the various departments of the government, the farmer who supplies the soldiers of the army and the sailors of the navy, the artisan who toils in the nation's workshops, or the mechanics and laborers who build its edifices and construct its forts and vessels of war, should, in payment of their just and hard-earned dues, receive depreciated paper, while another class of their countrymen, no more deserving, are paid in coin of gold and silver. And I would argue, no more deserving, what did they loan you? Like, they did not loan you anything. It drives me nuts. Okay, with the end of Lincoln's greenbacks, the U.S. could no longer create its own interest-free money, and was manipulated during the term of President Rutherford B. Hayes into borrowing from the Rothschilds' banking system in 1878, restoring to the Rothschilds control of the U.S. economy they had lost under Andrew Jackson. From Rothschilds and Sons to Mr. Sherman, so that's Honorable John Sherman, Secretary of the Treasury, Washington, D.C. Very pleased we have entered into relations again with the American government. Shall do our best to make the businesses successful. Rothschilds. And I just want you to recognize, that because we're discussing the Civil War, essentially, that's why we ended here in 1881. But the documenting all wars are bankers' wars continues the narrative all the way up until 2012. And that's just because of the date of publication, right? So considering that we're now in 2021, there's a whole other, slew of things that would go into this same information in the last, 10 years.
Yeah, which I think you've done a good job of laying out how nuanced everything actually was, as opposed to the way that people want to remember it or think that it played out, right? It was not even remotely as simple as one side was pro and one side was anti-slavery. That's not even close to.
There's so much more we're going to get to too, in addition to that. But I just want to point out that concept that you're pointing out, where it's oversimplified, right? And there's so much more to it that's subtle and nuanced. That is like any historical topic you ever research. It's just 100%. That's just like what you find. Yeah, you're probably fully aware. But just so the audience knows, that's just like a commonality of any historical thing, is people try to make out of history, which is really just the perspective of a person who experienced it, right? Yeah. It's not like the owner of the world who has the final say on the dictionary of the world and said that's what the facts are. You know what I mean? It's a perspective, right? If you didn't live over here or know about that guy or do anything over there, like, what can you really say about any of that? You know what I mean? But
Oh
In
yeah.
the
Well,
end, they want to take those perspectives and make them so hard and so, that's what everybody believed, and then spin a narrative that causes to infight that, yeah,
well, and the framers of history are also typically the victors, right? So they want to see the historical record portray them in the best light possible, right? And
definitely.
so, if you were the victor in the case of the Civil War, which it sounds like it's pretty much the bankers that were the biggest victors of the Civil War.
Well, right, the
Um,
North thinks they won, but it's really the bankers, and we're going to
yeah,
find it's a much larger syndicate.
and the painting of this as an altruistic endeavor or
Right,
this
right.
kind of defense of the humanity and the liberty and the freedom of the individual, specifically
Well,
the Southern Black individual, is
yeah,
not the main impetus,
right.
or it's not as hunky dory
Well,
as everyone thinks it is.
what we're going to learn is that, and just as you can imagine, like we're going to talk about this next time, but like the anti-slavery sentiment existed at the beginning of the Constitution, guys.
Yeah.
Like, why didn't we have an anti-slavery party until the Civil War?
Well,
Because it
not to
wasn't
not to mention the fact
because
that there was also an abolitionist movement in the South. Like it's not like the entirety of the South
well,
was a
sure.
monolith pro-slavery.
What
You
I'm
know,
trying to point out is that we had anti-slavery sentiment from the beginning of the Constitution, and yet didn't have an anti-slavery party until we had the Civil War.
hmm
So why? Why? Because you're going to find that basically the northern interests that were trying to accomplish a certain amount of government privilege, government-based privilege, couldn't do it any longer, and they co-opted a particularly popular sentiment of the North to get the rest of the states on board.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
not to mention the
It's like a
fact that
co-op.
they again, very intelligent, awful but intelligent people. They put
Mm-hmm.
two and two together and they were like, well, Southern slaves are this whole demographic of people that don't borrow and pay us back in silver and gold. So how great would
Exactly.
it be to have a working class that was now free to
Yep.
borrow money, consume, and pay us back in silver and gold? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it is extremely more
Same,
nefarious than
same for the women.
yeah,
Absolutely the same for the women. So
yes,
yeah, definitely. I'm excited for the next couple parts. I hope it's gonna be pretty insightful.
yeah.
This is more or
Well,
less like I said, I thought you guys would probably be familiar with this, but later we're gonna be talking about stuff that's a little less known.
good. I want to pull back the curtain because
Sweet.
you know
Awesome.
again it's the the people of the present that are looking back at the past find it very difficult, and we've echoed this repeatedly in prior episodes as well.
Hmm.
Looking back with you have to look back with the context and the definitions and the environment of the time. You
Yep.
can't look back at it as if everyone had the internet. Like the internet didn't exist 30
Right.
years ago, right? Or
Yeah.
whatever it is, 35 years ago, right? So if you want to look back 100 years and expect these folks to have the compendium of knowledge that we have available to us to this day, you're gravely mistaken. It was not true.
Hmm.
So that being said, look, I'm glad we're continuing to do these. This is fantastic. Everyone should definitely check out in the show notes. I have the link to American Natural Rights Foundation. So
Awesome.
go out there and find out
Yeah,
some more information about
we're totally
Josiah's.
ready for you. Yeah, we got a
And,
bunch of stuff going on, so definitely hit us up.
and you guys are going to be ramping up some of your efforts too in some other areas too, which is I think people should keep abreast to because
Yep. Yeah,
there's
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say there's going to be some really good stuff coming down the pike.
We got we got a new educator who joined our team. We got a couple new researchers. Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, with that, again, thank you, Josiah. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
We will be back with another episode of Ungovernable Monday night. We're going to be talking about 3D printing 101. What oppressed peoples wouldn't want 3D printers? I'll tell you that right now.
Hey man, print your own notes of exchange. No, I'm just
Yeah,
kidding.
that's true. Out
Right?
of more than just nothing.
Right? Right? You can
So,
melt this down and make new 3D printed items out of it.
yeah,
It's literally got 12 cents value. No, I'm just kidding. No,
that
that's
is
awesome. I
entirely
think
true.
that's so awesome. That's really exciting that you got that coming up.
Yeah, no. So Monday night, so we'll have someone who is a returner to the program, Sal the Agorist, will be on, and then we have the 3D printing general will be on from
So,
does a bunch of stuff on YouTube, so it should be fun.
heck yeah.
So Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern. All right, well, Josiah, thank you very
Thanks a
much. I
lot.
appreciate it. Everyone who made it to the end of the video, thank you very much as well. Like, comment, subscribe, share, put it out there. We love having you, and I will see everyone Monday evening. Have a good one.
All right. Thanks, Matt.